Out on the edge of a sleepy little town, there was a farm that had been around for as long as anyone could remember. It wasn't fancy or modern like some of the big estates nearby. It was simple, peaceful, and full of life. Rolling fields stretched out in every direction, painted with vibrant sunflowers and rows of lavender that swayed gently in the breeze. There were fruit trees heavy with apples and peaches, their branches bending low as if bowing to the earth beneath them. And then there was the old barn, weathered but sturdy, standing tall like a silent witness to decades of hard work and memories. The person behind all this beauty lived quietly, keeping mostly to herself. She didn't throw parties or attend neighborhood gatherings. Instead, she spent her days tending to the land, planting seeds, and watching things grow. Her name wasn't important. What mattered was how deeply connected she felt to the soil under her feet. For her, the farm wasn't just property. It was home. Every blade of grass, every rustling leaf told a story. These stories weren't hers alone. They belonged to her parents, grandparents, and even great-grandparents who once worked the same land. But living near the farm came with its own set of challenges. You see, the area where the farm sat wasn't exactly rural anymore. Over time, developers had moved in, building gated communities filled with cookie-cutter houses and manicured lawns. One such community called itself Harmony Hills, and while it sounded nice on paper, it wasn't always harmonious. The people who lived there liked rules, a lot of them. Rules about what color you could paint your front door, how high your hedges could grow, and whether you could leave your trash cans visible from the street. All these rules were enforced by something known as the Homeowners Association, or HOA for short. At the head of this HOA was someone who loved being in charge. This woman ran the show with an iron fist, making sure everyone followed the rules down to the last detail. She thrived on control, organizing events and fundraisers that showcased her impeccable taste. Everyone knew her name because she made sure they did. If she said jump, most folks asked how high. But not the farmer. No matter how many times invitations arrived in her mailbox, she declined politely. She had no interest in joining committees or attending cocktail hours. Her world revolved around the farm, and she preferred it that way. Things stayed peaceful for a long time. Sure, there were occasional complaints from neighbors about noise from tractors early in the morning or dust drifting onto their driveways during harvest season, but nothing too serious. That is, until one sunny afternoon when everything changed. It started innocently enough. The HOA president showed up at the farm unannounced, wearing designer sunglasses and carrying a clipboard like she owned the place. She walked right up to the farmhouse, knocking confidently on the wooden door. When the farmer answered, the president launched into her pitch without missing a beat. Apparently, her daughter was getting married soon, and she'd decided the perfect spot for the ceremony was none other than the very farm she stood on. Now, anyone familiar with the situation might have expected the farmer to agree. After all, weddings meant money, and hosting one could bring in extra cash. But the farmer wasn't interested. She explained firmly that the farm wasn't available for rent, no matter how special the occasion. The president nodded, smiled, and left, promising to respect the decision. Or so it seemed. A few days later, the farmer returned home after running errands to find chaos unfolding on her property. Trucks rumbled back and forth, hauling equipment and supplies. Workers scurried around, hammering stakes into the ground and stringing lights between poles. A massive tent took shape in the middle of the lavender field, and signs bearing phrases like Dream Day and Love Forever dotted the landscape. Confused and furious, the farmer stormed over to the workers, demanding answers. They shrugged, saying they'd been hired by the HOA president and assumed everything was approved. When she confronted the president directly, the response was chilling. With a smug grin, the woman reminded her of certain clauses buried deep within the HOA agreement, clauses that supposedly allowed the association to use private property for community events. And just like that, the fight began. The farmer tried everything she could think of to reclaim her land. She called lawyers, filed complaints with local authorities, and even pleaded with neighbors to intervene. But the president's influence ran deep. People looked away, unwilling to challenge her authority. Even the police dismissed her concerns, citing vague legal jargon that favored the HOA. As weeks passed, the farm transformed into a bustling hub of activity. Trailers clogged the driveway, caterers stomped through flower beds, and generators roared late into the night. The farmer watched helplessly as her sanctuary turned into a circus. Worst of all, the president treated her like part of the staff, barking orders and criticizing her refusal to cooperate. It was clear that reasoning wouldn't solve anything. So the farmer retreated to her house, seething with frustration, but also formulating a plan. If they wanted her farm for their precious wedding, fine. They'd get their dream day, just not the way they imagined. Little did they know, revenge was brewing, and it would hit them harder than they ever expected. The days leading up to the wedding turned into a nightmare for the farmer. It wasn't just about losing control of her land. It was the sheer disrespect and chaos that followed. The farm, once a place of peace and quiet, became unrecognizable. Every morning she woke up to the sound of trucks rumbling down her driveway, their engines growling like angry beasts. Men in uniforms stomped across her fields, carrying equipment and shouting orders at each other. Tents popped up overnight, swallowing patches of lavender and sunflowers that had taken years to nurture. Fairy lights crisscrossed the trees as if the farm were some kind of carnival ground. At first, the farmer tried to reason with the workers. She approached them politely, explaining that this was private property and they didn't have permission to be there. But they barely glanced at her, brushing her off with vague answers like, "We're just doing our job," or "Talk to the boss." When she confronted the HOA president again, the woman simply smirked and told her not to worry. Everything would be cleaned up after the big day. "It's only temporary," she said, as though that made it okay. Temporary? To the farmer, it felt like an invasion without an end in sight. Things got worse when the guests started arriving. Days before the actual wedding, people began showing up at the farm like it was some kind of resort. Trailers lined the driveway, spilling over onto the grass. Kids ran wild through the orchard, climbing fruit trees and breaking branches. Catering vans parked wherever they pleased, crushing delicate plants under their tires. And then there was the noise, the constant hum of generators, the clinking of cutlery, and the endless chatter of strangers who treated her home like their personal playground. The farmer tried to stay out of sight, retreating to her farmhouse whenever possible. But even inside, she couldn't escape the madness. The smell of grilled food wafted through her windows, mixing with the stench of overflowing trash bins. At night, music blared from portable speakers, keeping her awake until the early hours. Sleep became a distant memory. Every time she closed her eyes, all she could think about was how much damage was being done to her land, and how powerless she felt to stop it. What hurt the most was the way the HOA president treated her. Instead of acknowledging the harm she'd caused, the woman acted like the farmer should be grateful for the attention. She barked orders at her as though she worked for the wedding crew. "Can you move those tools out of the way?" she'd say, pointing to items that had been on the farm long before any of this madness began. Or, "Make sure no one parks near the flower beds." As if the farmer had anything left to protect. Her once pristine flower beds were already trampled beyond recognition. The farmer's frustration boiled over one afternoon when she found a group of workers using her barn as storage. Boxes of decorations, chairs, and tablecloths were stacked haphazardly inside, leaving almost no room to move. The barn, which had stood untouched for decades, now looked like a warehouse. She marched over to the foreman, demanding they remove everything immediately. He shrugged and said he was just following instructions. "You'll have to take it up with the HOA," he muttered before walking away. That evening, sitting alone in her kitchen with a cup of tea, the farmer realized something important. Pleading and arguing weren't going to fix this. These people had no intention of listening to her. They saw her as nothing more than an obstacle, a stubborn old woman standing in the way of their perfect plans. Well, if they wanted her farm for their dream wedding, they'd get exactly what they deserved. Not perfection, but pandemonium. She spent the next few nights mapping out her strategy. Revenge wasn't something she took lightly, but this wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. It was about justice. Justice for her land, her hard work, and her dignity. She knew she couldn't fight them head-on. They had money, influence, and numbers on their side. But she had something they didn't: knowledge of the land. Every inch of that farm was familiar to her, every pipe and wire hidden beneath the soil. If anyone could turn the tables, it was her. Her plan involved subtle sabotage, things that wouldn't draw suspicion but would cause enough disruption to ruin their precious day. First, she rerouted the water lines feeding the irrigation system. By digging trenches in strategic spots, she created weak points that would collapse under pressure during the event. Sinkholes might not seem glamorous, but they'd certainly grab everyone's attention. Next, she tampered with the portable toilets scattered around the property. A few tweaks here and there ensured they'd overflow at the worst possible moment. Nothing screamed disaster quite like a flooded restroom, but her pièce de resistance came when she hacked into the GPS systems of the delivery trucks scheduled to bring food, flowers, and other essentials. Using her basic computer skills and a bit of ingenuity, she redirected them to random locations miles away. Let them figure that one out on the morning of the wedding. As the big day approached, the farm buzzed with activity. Decorators hung garlands, chefs prepared meals, and florists arranged bouquets. Guests arrived dressed in pastel shades, chatting excitedly about the upcoming ceremony. From her window, the farmer watched it all unfold with a mix of anger and satisfaction. They thought they had everything under control, but they were wrong. Dead wrong. On the morning of the wedding, the sky was clear and the air smelled sweet, with blooming flowers, or at least it did until the first disaster struck. One of the main tents collapsed suddenly, sending tables, chairs, and centerpieces tumbling into the mud. Screams erupted as guests scrambled to avoid falling debris. Then came the smell. Portable toilets overflowed, spilling waste onto the lawn and creating a nauseating stench that lingered in the air. People gagged, covering their noses as they fled the scene. The final blow came when the catering truck failed to show up. Hours passed and still no food arrived. Guests grew restless, complaining loudly about hunger and discomfort. Some demanded refunds, others threatened lawsuits. The HOA president, red-faced and frantic, ran around trying to salvage the situation, but it was too late. Chaos had taken over and there was no stopping it. By the time the reception was supposed to start, half the attendees had already left, muttering about how this was the worst wedding they'd ever attended. Meanwhile, the farmer sat on her porch sipping tea and watching the pandemonium unfold. Justice, she thought, had been served. The farmer didn't sleep much the night before the wedding. She wasn't nervous, far from it. In fact, she felt a strange kind of calm, like a storm chaser who had spent weeks tracking the perfect hurricane and finally saw it brewing on the horizon. Her plan was set in motion, and now all she had to do was wait. The anticipation buzzed inside her, keeping her awake as she sat by the window, watching shadows move across the farm under the glow of floodlights. Workers were still rushing around, putting up final decorations and adjusting sound systems late into the night. It was almost funny, really. They were working so hard to make everything perfect, not realizing that perfection was the last thing they'd get. As dawn broke, the farm transformed into a hive of activity. Guests started arriving early, dressed in their finest outfits, chatting excitedly about the big day ahead. Women in flowing dresses carried bouquets while men adjusted their ties, trying to look casual but clearly feeling out of place among the dirt paths and uneven ground. Kids darted between tents, laughing and chasing each other, oblivious to the chaos that would soon unfold. Caterers hustled back and forth, carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres and bottles of champagne. Everything seemed picture perfect, at least for now. From her kitchen window, the farmer watched it all with quiet amusement. She sipped her morning coffee slowly, letting the warmth spread through her chest. This was her favorite part, not because she enjoyed seeing people suffer, but because she knew what was coming. These people had walked onto her land without permission, trampled her flowers, and treated her like an inconvenience. Now, they were about to learn what happened when you messed with someone who knew the land better than anyone else. The first sign of trouble came just as the ceremony was set to begin. A group of ushers stood near one of the larger tents, guiding guests to their seats. Suddenly, there was a loud creaking noise, followed by a sharp crack. Before anyone could react, the tent poles buckled, and the entire structure collapsed in slow motion. Tables tipped over, chairs flew into the air, and flower arrangements scattered everywhere. Screams erupted as guests scrambled to get out of the way. Some tripped over fallen chairs. Others slipped in the mud that had pooled beneath the tent. Within seconds, what was supposed to be a romantic outdoor setting turned into a chaotic mess. The HOA president appeared moments later, her face flushed with panic. She shouted orders at the workers, demanding they fix the problem immediately. But no one seemed to know what had caused the collapse. The farmer, watching from afar, allowed herself a small smile. She knew exactly what had happened. The sinkholes she'd created by rerouting the water lines had weakened the soil beneath the tent. When the weight of the structure pressed down, the ground gave way, taking the tent with it. It was simple physics. But to everyone else, it looked like bad luck or poor planning. While the tent disaster dominated everyone's attention, the next issue hit like a punch to the gut. Portable toilets, strategically placed around the farm for convenience, began to overflow. Streams of foul-smelling liquid spilled onto the grass, spreading quickly and creating a noxious stench that made people gag. Guests pinched their noses and backed away, muttering complaints under their breath. Mothers hurriedly pulled children away from the scene, while fathers tried to shield their families from the mess. One man, attempting to investigate the source of the problem, stepped directly into a puddle of sewage and let out a yell of disgust. His fancy leather shoes were ruined, and his expression said it all. This was not how he imagined spending his Saturday afternoon. By now, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. What was meant to be a joyful celebration had turned into a nightmare. People milled around aimlessly, unsure of what to do next. The bride, dressed in a stunning white gown, looked close to tears as her mother, the HOA president, rushed around frantically trying to salvage the situation. Photographers snapped pictures of the chaos instead of the happy couple, capturing images that would later become infamous in the community. Even the weather, which had been clear and sunny earlier, seemed to reflect the mood. Dark clouds rolled, casting a gloomy shadow over the farm. And then came the final blow. The catering truck never arrived. Hours passed and still no food. Guests grew increasingly restless, complaining loudly about hunger and thirst. Some demanded refunds, others threatened to leave. The caterers on site tried to improvise with snacks and bottled water, but it wasn't enough to satisfy the crowd. Whispers spread like wildfire. Did they forget about us? Why isn't anyone doing anything? This is ridiculous. Back at the farmhouse, the farmer leaned against her porch railing, observing the pandemonium with a mix of satisfaction and relief. She hadn't wanted to hurt anyone. Not really. Her goal was to send a message, to show these people that they couldn't just barge into someone's life and expect everything to go smoothly. By hacking into the GPS systems of the delivery trucks, she had ensured that key supplies would end up miles away, leaving the organizers scrambling to figure out where things went wrong. It was clever, subtle, and most importantly, untraceable. As the hours dragged on, the wedding fell apart completely. Half the guests left in frustration, climbing into their cars and driving off without looking back. Those who stayed huddled together, grumbling about the disaster they'd witnessed. The HOA president, once so confident and commanding, looked utterly defeated. Her dream day had turned into a public embarrassment, and everyone knew it. For the farmer, though, this wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming her dignity and proving that even the quietest person can stand up against injustice. As she watched the remnants of the wedding crumble around her, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. The farm might have been damaged, but it was still hers, and no amount of money or power could change that. The wedding day had turned into a spectacle no one could have predicted, not even the farmer herself. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the farm, the chaos only seemed to grow worse. The guests, who hadn't already fled, were now huddled in small groups, whispering furiously and glancing around like they were stranded on some remote island instead of standing on what was supposed to be a beautiful piece of land. The bride, still wearing her elegant gown but looking more disheveled by the minute, sat slumped on a folding chair near the ruins of the collapsed tent. Her mascara had smudged under her eyes, giving her a haunted appearance. Every so often, she'd glance toward her mother, the HOA president, as if waiting for her to fix everything. But the woman who usually had all the answers was nowhere to be seen. Meanwhile, the HOA president darted from one disaster zone to another, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cooling evening air. She barked orders at anyone within earshot, though most people ignored her or simply shrugged helplessly. Workers tried to prop up the fallen tent poles with whatever materials they could find, but every attempt ended in failure. The ground beneath them was too unstable thanks to the sinkholes the farmer had carefully engineered. Each time someone stepped near one of those weak spots, the earth shifted ominously, making the situation even worse. It was as if the land itself was fighting back, and in a way it was. The stench from the overflowing portable toilets lingered heavily in the air, clinging to clothes and hair. Guests held handkerchiefs or napkins over their noses, trying desperately to block out the smell. One man gagged loudly before storming off, muttering something about suing whoever was responsible for this mess. A few kids, oblivious to the tension, played tag between the puddles of sewage, much to their parents' horror. "Get them away from there," someone shouted. But it was too late. One child slipped and landed directly in the muck, wailing loudly as his mother rushed over to clean him up. And then there was the food, or rather the lack of it. The caterers had done their best to improvise with leftover snacks and bottled water, but it wasn't nearly enough to feed the crowd. People grew increasingly agitated, their hunger turning into anger. Some demanded refunds, others threatened legal action. A group of older guests gathered near the barn, grumbling loudly about how this was the worst event they'd ever attended. "This isn't a wedding," one woman snapped. "It's a circus." Another chimed in, "I don't care how much money they spent on this is unacceptable." As the reception hour approached, things went from bad to unbearable. The band hired to play live music showed up late, only to discover that half their equipment wasn't working properly. Someone suggested using a Bluetooth speaker instead, but the sound quality was terrible, cutting out mid-song and leaving awkward silences where laughter should have been. The dance floor, a patch of grass marked off with ribbons, remained empty except for a few toddlers chasing each other. No one felt like celebrating anymore. Back at the farmhouse, the farmer watched it all unfold with a mix of satisfaction and disbelief. She hadn't expected the scale of the chaos to reach this level, but she couldn't deny it was effective. These people who had treated her farm like their personal playground were finally getting a taste of what it meant to lose control. They had come here expecting perfection, but instead, they got reality. A messy, unpredictable, uncontrollable reality. Still, she didn't gloat. Revenge wasn't about gloating. It was about balance. For weeks, these strangers had disrupted her life, trampling her flowers, invading her space, and treating her like an obstacle to be ignored. Now they were experiencing what it felt like to have their plans fall apart. And yet, watching the bride sit alone, tears streaming down her face, the farmer felt a flicker of sympathy. This young woman hadn't asked for any of this. She'd probably dreamed of her special day for years, imagining it filled with love and joy. Instead, she got mud, sewage, and disappointment. But sympathy didn't change the facts. The HOA president had made a choice when she decided to take over the farm without permission. She had wielded her power recklessly, assuming that rules and influence would protect her from consequences. What she hadn't counted on was someone fighting back, not with violence or threats, but with intelligence and patience. The farmer had used her knowledge of the land to turn the tables, exposing the fragility of their so-called perfect plans. As darkness fell, the remaining guests began to leave in droves. Cars lined up along the driveway, headlights cutting through the dusk as engines roared to life. Some rolled down their windows to shout parting words, most of them unkind, at the HOA president, who stood frozen near the entrance, her face pale and drawn. She looked smaller somehow, less intimidating. than she had just days ago. The weight of the day's disasters seemed to press down on her shoulders, crushing her usual confidence. By the time the last car disappeared down the road, the farm was eerily quiet. The generator sputtered and died, plunging the area into darkness. Only the soft rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of crickets broke the silence. The farmer stepped outside, breathing in the cool night air. The scent of lavender and fresh earth replaced the earlier stench of sewage, a reminder that the land always found a way to heal itself. She walked slowly through the fields, assessing the damage. The flower beds were trampled, the soil churned, up in places where tents had collapsed. Broken chairs and scattered decorations littered the ground, evidence of the day's events. But it wasn't permanent. With time and effort, she could fix it. She always did. As she stood there looking out over her land, she realized something important. The real victory wasn't in ruining the wedding. It was in proving that no one, not even someone with money and authority, could take away what mattered most. Her farm wasn't just dirt and plants, it was her legacy, her sanctuary, her home, and she had defended it in the only way she knew how. With a deep breath, she turned back toward the farmhouse, ready to start cleaning up. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace. Justice had been served and the land was hers again. The aftermath of the wedding disaster spread through Harmony Hills like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone in the gated community was talking about what had happened. Neighbors gathered on front porches, sipping coffee and swapping stories. They'd heard from guests who attended or fled the event. Some recounted the tent collapse with dramatic hand gestures, mimicking the slow-motion fall of chairs and tables. Others described the unbearable smell from the overflowing toilets, wrinkling their noses as if reliving the moment. The phrase "worst wedding ever" echoed through conversations, becoming almost a punchline. But not everyone found humor in it. The HOA president, once a towering figure of authority, became the subject of ridicule overnight. People whispered, behind her back, questioning how she could let such a catastrophe happen under her watch. Rumors swirled about her heavy-handed tactics, how she'd bullied her way into using the farm without permission, ignored legal boundaries, and silenced anyone who dared oppose her. What had once been fear turned into resentment. Neighbors, who used to nod politely or offer forced smiles, now avoided eye contact altogether. For the farmer, life slowly began to return to normal, or at least as close to normal as possible after weeks of chaos. The day after the wedding, she woke up early and got straight to work. Broken chairs and scattered decorations littered the fields, but she tackled them one piece at a time. She hauled away trash, repaired damaged fences, and replanted crushed flower beds. It was hard physical labor, but it gave her a sense of purpose. Each shovelful of dirt she turned over felt like reclaiming another piece of herself. Neighbors started noticing her efforts. At first, they kept their distance, unsure whether she wanted company or help. But as days passed, a few brave souls approached her cautiously. One afternoon, an elderly couple from down the road stopped by with a tray of homemade cookies. They apologized for staying silent during the takeover, explaining that they hadn't known what to do. "You stood your ground," the man said, his voice filled with admiration. "We should have done the same." Others followed suit. A young mother brought her 2 kids to the farm, offering to help clean up in exchange for fresh produce from the orchard. A retired handyman offered to fix the barn door, which had been damaged when workers stuffed it with supplies. Even the local nursery owner delivered bags of soil and seedlings free of charge, saying he admired her determination to fight back against injustice. At first, the farmer accepted their gestures warily. Trust didn't come easily, not after everything she'd been through. But as more people reached out, she realized something important. The wedding fiasco hadn't just exposed the HOA president's flaws. It had also revealed cracks in the community itself. Many of her neighbors admitted they'd been too afraid to speak up before, intimidated by the president's domineering personality. Now, inspired by the farmer's quiet strength, they were finding their voices. The backlash against the HOA president grew louder with each passing week. Petitions circulated demanding her removal from office. Dozens of signatures appeared within days, including those of longtime residents who had previously supported her leadership. Town hall meetings, once sparsely attended, drew crowds eager to discuss changes to the association's policies. For the first time in years, people spoke openly about fairness, transparency, and respect for private property. The farmer stayed out of these discussions, preferring to focus on her farm, but she couldn't ignore the ripple effect her actions had created. Despite the newfound camaraderie, the farmer remained cautious. She knew better than to trust blindly again. While some neighbors genuinely meant well, others might simply be riding the wave of goodwill until things settled down. So, she kept her interactions polite but distant, accepting help only when absolutely necessary. Her priority was restoring the farm, not rebuilding relationships. As the weeks turned into months, signs of recovery began to show. New shoots sprouted in the flower beds, replacing the ones trampled during the wedding. The orchard regained its vibrancy, branches heavy with ripening fruit. Even the old barn looked better than ever thanks to the handyman's repairs. Visitors remarked on how peaceful the farm felt now, almost as though the land itself was healing alongside its caretaker. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the farmer sat on her porch with a cup of tea. She watched the fields sway gently in the breeze, listening to the familiar sounds of crickets chirping and leaves rustling. For the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. The scars of the past few months would take time to fade completely, but she knew she'd come out stronger on the other side. Her thoughts drifted briefly to the HOA president. Word around town was that the woman had quietly moved out of Harmony Hills, unable to face the shame of her public downfall. Some said she'd relocated to another state. Others claimed she was living with family, hiding from the fallout. Either way, her absence marked the beginning of a new chapter for the community, one built on mutual respect rather than fear. The farmer smiled softly as she sipped her tea, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. For her land, for her resilience, and for the unexpected allies who had emerged in her darkest hour. Life wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But sometimes standing up for yourself, even in the smallest ways, could spark change far beyond what you imagined. And that, she thought, was worth every sleepless night and every drop of sweat she'd poured into protecting her home. Months had passed since the wedding disaster, and Harmony Hills was a different place. The once dominating presence of the HOA president was gone, leaving behind a community that felt lighter, freer, almost like it could breathe again. People who had kept to themselves before now exchanged warm greetings at the mailbox or stopped to chat while walking their dogs. There was a newfound sense of unity, not because everyone suddenly got along perfectly, but because they were learning how to work together instead of living under the shadow of one person's ego. For the farmer, life on the farm had returned to its peaceful rhythm. The fields were thriving, the barn stood sturdy and strong, and the lavender swayed in the breeze as if nothing had ever disturbed them. But things weren't exactly the same. Neighbors who had once ignored her now made an effort to check in, bringing over baskets of fresh bread or offering to lend a hand during harvest season. Some even brought their kids to visit, letting them run through the orchard and learn about planting seeds. To the farmer, these small moments were both surprising and heartwarming. She hadn't expected kindness after all she'd been through, but it reminded her that people weren't always defined by their worst actions, or their silence when others acted poorly. Still, she remained careful. Trust wasn't something you handed out easily when you'd seen what happened when power went unchecked. While she appreciated the gestures from her neighbors, she kept her walls up, metaphorically speaking. It wasn't hostility. It was self-preservation. She knew better than to let herself be vulnerable too quickly. After all, communities could change, but human nature rarely did. One crisp autumn morning, the farmer received an unexpected visitor. A man in his late 50s, dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt, knocked on her farmhouse door holding a clipboard. At first she tensed, thinking he might be another official or someone sent by the HOA remnants to stir up trouble. But when he introduced himself as part of a new committee formed to revamp the neighborhood's policies, She relaxed slightly. He explained that they wanted to rewrite the rules to make them fairer for everyone, not just those with money or influence. They'd heard about what she'd been through and hoped she'd share her perspective. At first, she hesitated. Getting involved meant opening old wounds, reliving the frustration and anger she'd worked so hard to move past. But then she realized something. Staying silent wouldn't protect her or anyone else in the long run. If she wanted real change, she had to contribute, even if it meant stepping outside her comfort zone. So she agreed to meet with the committee, sharing her story and offering suggestions for clearer guidelines around property rights and transparency within the HOA. Her involvement sparked a wave of reform in Harmony Hills. New policies were introduced, ensuring that decisions affecting residents required majority approval rather than being dictated by a single leader. Meetings became more inclusive, with opportunities for input from all members. Slowly but surely, the community began to rebuild itself, not just structurally but emotionally. People started looking out for each other, forming bonds that went beyond surface-level pleasantries. As winter approached, the farmer stood in her fields, watching frost glisten on the grass like tiny diamonds scattered across the earth. The air smelled clean and sharp, carrying the promise of renewal. She thought back to everything she'd endured, the invasion, the chaos, the sleepless nights, and marveled at how far she'd come. Her fight hadn't just saved her farm, it had inspired others to stand up for themselves too. That realization filled her with a quiet pride. But there was something else, a deeper lesson she'd learned along the way. Revenge, she realized, wasn't about destruction. It was about reclaiming your power and showing the world that no one could take what was rightfully yours. For her, that meant protecting her land, her legacy, and her dignity. And while she hadn't set out to change an entire community, she couldn't deny the impact her actions had made. The farm, once a battleground, had become a symbol of resilience. Visitors often commented on how beautiful it looked, unaware of the scars hidden beneath its surface. To the farmer, though, those scars told a story, one of struggle, strength, and survival. Every broken fence post she repaired, every flower bed she replanted, was proof that even the hardest battles could be won with patience and determination. On Christmas Eve, the farmer hosted a small gathering at the farm. It wasn't planned, just a casual invitation extended to a few neighbors who had helped her during the cleanup months earlier. They arrived bearing dishes of homemade food, bottles of wine, and laughter that echoed through the barn. Kids ran around playing hide-and-seek among the rows of trees, while adults sat on hay bales swapping stories. Someone strummed a guitar, filling the air with soft melodies. For the first time in years, the farm felt alive with joy instead of tension. As the evening drew to a close, the farmer stepped outside to watch the stars. The sky stretched endlessly above her, vast and unchanging. She thought about how much had changed in such a short time, not just in her life, but in the lives of those around her. The HOA president's downfall had been swift and inevitable, but the ripple effects of her actions had created something lasting, a community willing to grow, adapt, and support each other. She smiled softly, pulling her coat tighter against the chill. Life wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But standing there, surrounded by the sounds of laughter and music drifting from the barn, she felt grateful. Grateful for her land, for her courage, and for the reminder that sometimes standing up for yourself could lead to something bigger than you ever imagined. And as she turned to head back inside, ready to join the celebration, she knew one thing, for certain. No matter what challenges lay ahead, she'd face them with the same quiet strength that had carried her this far. Because the farm wasn't just her home, it was her heart. And nothing, not even the most entitled HOA president, could take that away.